I'll say that my personal opinion as a historian who studies capitalism is that capitalism has been distinctly good at producing wealth, and it has also been um, highly effective at exploiting both natural resources and laborers to produce that wealth. So, in thinking about the longue durée of capitalism, right? The long history of capitalism. One of the things that I think, or the two things that I think go hand in hand in looking at capitalism is massive wealth and massive exploitation. Now, that doesn't mean that capitalism has to be exploitative, which I think is important to consider, right? It only means that it tends to be, that it lends itself to exploitation. So, when I used to teach undergrads more often, I would often ask them, is capitalism bad, right? So raise your hand if you think capitalism is bad, raise your hand if you think capitalism is good, right? And, I'd have people on both sides of that argument. And then I would say, no economic system is inherently bad or good, right? So, mercantilism preceded capitalism, and similarly, it had its pros and it had its cons, and capitalism is the same. So I would say that my solution, which isn't a good one, to capitalism's ills, is that capitalism is something that we as people decide to participate in. And the way in which we decide to participate shapes the way in which capitalism. So, one of the things that I always point out when I teach the history of capitalism is not natural, right? So there was this idea, we call it a Whiggish interpretation of history, right? That history is on this path toward progress, right? And that capitalism was the next natural evolution of economic systems, right? And that's simply not true, right? So capitalism isn't natural. Capitalism emerged because people in specific places, in specific times, in specific contexts, made decisions. And those decisions have led to an economic system that shapes the world. And it's produced a lot of good. So when I teach my med students, we talk about medical advances, medical technologies that are fundamentally related to needing capital and substantial amounts of capital for research and development. At the same time, we look at how capitalism shapes medicine, both in the United States and globally, in ways that are exploitative, in ways that are discriminatory, and are fundamentally tied to it as a system. And so, I don't know that I have a sort of, here's how we solve the ills of capitalism while keeping the good parts, except to say that I think when capitalism is more adequately paired with democracy, it better reflects the will of the people. And the less well that it's paired with democracy, the less it reflects the will of the people. So I also ask students frequently, can you have capitalism without democracy? And the answer is absolutely yes. Right. So in the United States, we think of them as synonymous, and they aren't. Capitalism is an economic system that dictates political institutions, that dominates cultural institutions. But you can have democracy without capitalism. You can have capitalism without democracy, right? So we have an excellent contemporary example of that, right? So China has become increasingly capitalistic in the last decades, and has seen substantial economic growth because of it. But it isn't democratic, right? So capitalism as a system is not synonymous with democracy as a political institution. So all that to say, I think the best solution is for what people want, as a society to be more closely aligned with the way that their economy works. And in our country, I think there are a lot of problems with that marriage. I think that there are some serious disconnects between what people want and the way our economy works. And you hinted at one that I think is a really important one. So the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case decided that corporations are people, right? And so since corporations are people, corporations are allowed to participate in the political process as if they are people, meaning they can give as much money as they want, and it's secret, right? And that's problematic, and it's problematic in ways that are obvious and that tie back to my research, right? Because when I look at who was successful in Appalachia in the 19th century, it's people who had money, people who had capital, right? So I think that our political institutions reflect that same dynamic, that frequently legislation gets passed because it has money behind it, not necessarily because it's what Americans want. And so that just, to bring us back, I think the closer we can align the will of the people with the way that our economy works, whether that's good or bad, I think it's how society, it's how an economic system most accurately reflects the people who live within that system. And what that leads to is dependent upon the society that we're looking at, and a whole host of other contexts.